I've been putting off getting in front of the camera for a while, mostly because I've got so many ideas and so little time to dedicate to doing anything right now. There's just so much that needs to be done, so little time, and even less motivation to get it done. But I think if I want to feel a sense of closure, I'm gonna need to hunker down and say my piece. Legends ZA is a bad Pokemon game. Wow, it is cold. Um, so for those of you that don't know, Pokemon released a new game. I think it was this year. I think it was in October, maybe. Yeah, it was October 16th of this year. They released Pokemon Legends ZA, and um, it's fine, right? I mean, it's tough to really talk about Pokemon because fans tend to fall into two very large, very vocal categories. Either they're the type of fan that will glaze a Pokemon game no matter what. It could be the worst thing that's ever been created under the sun by man or machine, and they will talk about it like it's the freaking Mona Lisa, like it's Game Freak's magnum opus, even if Game Freak wasn't the one that developed it. Or they're gonna hate it no matter what. It could be the greatest game that's ever been produced. The gameplay loop could be the most satisfying thing you've ever experienced. It could have zero glitches, zero technical problems, and they would still find reasons to hate it. And both of those people are going to sink hundreds, if not thousands, of hours into that same game and see nothing wrong with that perspective. And it's frustrating from the perspective of somebody that tries to at least be balanced when they talk about Pokemon. You know, it's hard as somebody that was so thoroughly bullied as a child and found refuge in Pokemon, not only as a franchise, but as a common interest among the few people that were nice to me back in the day. It's difficult to not feel a sense of connection to this franchise and to feel personally slighted every time Game Freak or one of its outsourced cronies decides to mess with something that I consider sacred, right? And as somebody who's been playing since 2005 when I was 10 years old and spent pretty much the entirety of my formative years being formed by Pikachu, it's tough to look at a Pikachu and not feel at least a little bit of joy. Even if I do recognize that that joy is mostly artificial and mostly built on nostalgia. But with how unbelievably cooked the world is right now, finding these little pockets of enjoyment has been the only thing keeping me going, aside from, you know, making something of myself and making a life for myself. It's the only thing that really distracts me from the real world woes. It's difficult to find stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I feel a sense of accomplishment when I complete the Pokédex in a new Pokemon game. I feel like I've done something worthwhile when I finally come across a hard to get shiny Pokemon, whether it's in the new games or it's in an old game. And I feel like I've joined something bigger than myself whenever I find a new community of people enjoying this game in a new way. Whether it was the people playing competitive when I was in high school, playing Wi-Fi battles. In fact, there's a video you can find on Game Boy Luke's channel from, I believe it's from 2013, where he played me as a viewer. We interacted on Twitter and we did a Wi-Fi battle, and he absolutely cooked me with a Zoroark because I was a moron. I mean, I was 18 at the time, so yeah, I wasn't exactly like sporting a fully developed frontal lobe at that point, but I considered myself a pretty good Pokemon player. You know, I had a pretty decent rating on Smogon, uh, on Pokemon Showdown, and I frequented Smogon to look at sets, and I had a pretty good grasp on what made a Pokemon good and what made a Pokemon bad, especially in Gen 5 OU. I played a lot of it back in the day, and I continued to play it when we went into Gen 6, and I kind of fell off in Gen 7. But, you know, as somebody who's played the franchise for so long and played so many of the games, I have a certain idea of what I think a good Pokemon game is. And sometimes, in order for a Pokemon game to be good, it actually has to do none of that. In what is ostensibly one of the biggest upsets in probably the history of the Pokemon franchise, we saw the release of a game that completely upended what we thought a Pokemon game could be. For, I mean, at that point, like 2 decades, we were seeing pretty much the same Pokemon game over and over again, with a lot of graphical and gameplay improvements that sometimes didn't really gel with the core gameplay loop of Pokemon. Like, for example, in the jump from Generation 5 to Generation 6, they tried to make it where you no longer had to adhere to the grid system of the region, but the region was still designed on a grid. And the movement often encouraged you to use the grid, but it also required you at certain points to use the mechanics that broke the grid system. For example, every time you would enter into a trainer's line of sight, if you weren't currently on the grid, it would jump you to the nearest square on the grid that was within the line of sight of the trainer, and then the trainer would walk towards you to engage in a battle. In addition to that, the exact same thing would happen if you were using your roller skates, which is the movement that did not adhere to the grid system, and then you switched to using the D-pad to move, which used the grid system. It would jump you into the nearest square, and then you would start walking on the grid. But those roller skates were required for certain sections because in order to get from one area to another, you would have to use these rails that you could not get on except by approaching them on your roller skates. And the roller skates were a cool movement mechanic, and I think that if they had continued to try and improve how they worked, it could have been a cool way to move around the region. But like with pretty much every other thing that Game Freak does with these Pokemon games, they come up with a cool concept and then they absolutely throw it to the floor in favor of a completely new gimmick that also has to be beta tested by the players. Because the move from X and Y to Oris remain pretty much the same in terms of the movement, but the jump from the bike, which did not use the grid, and the walking, which did use the grid, was a much more seamless transition. There was no roller skates anymore, from what I remember, and the only way to not adhere to the grid system was to walk around or run around with your joystick, because the 3DS had both a D-pad and a joystick, and that's how they sort of differentiated the movements. Is the D-pad was for the grid movement and the joystick was for non-grid movement, and it did not feel quite as jarring going from one to the other. And when you went off the bike, it made sense because you're hopping off of your bike. So even if it was kind of a jarring change, that is present in games that have the grid system and never break it. Because jumping off your bike is just a change in the sprite of your player. The sprite changes from being the on the bike sprite to the off the bike sprite, or model, or whatever you want to call it, depending on what game we're talking about. So that movement was pretty seamless. And you see moments like this throughout the franchise. You see so many times where a jump from one technology to another comes with Game Freak trying to explore that technology and sort of see what they can do with it. And oftentimes in doing so, the players wind up being beta testers for the games. And nowhere is this more apparent than in some of the more recent Pokemon games, where if you look at the most recent game that introduces a new region, Scarlet and Violet, like, so many glitches day one, and even up to this day, it is such a difficult game to play on the original Switch. The game lags, certain areas you can barely move around in because there's so much happening, the Switch just can't handle it. And to see that the game runs so much more smoothly on the Switch 2 once you get the performance update, it's night and day, really. Like, and you look at a game like Sword and Shield, playing it on the Switch versus the Switch 2, I've seen people do comparison tests, and it's just not as stark. Like, there was something in that performance update that Nintendo pushed to Scarlet and Violet that really helped it be able to more easily utilize the improved hardware of the Switch 2. And we're not talking about like a jump from like the Xbox 360 to the Xbox One, where there's like, you know, teraflops better computing performance. I mean, the Switch and the Switch 2 are still like several console generations out of date in terms of their performance. Nintendo has never prioritized making their consoles performance based. They're always based on a specific gimmick. And to a certain extent, that's always kind of hindered the way that they develop their games. Like, Game Freak is developing games as if they have access to something like a PS4 or a PS5 even, or an Xbox One, or whatever the console is after the Xbox One. I forget what they're called. But they're working under the assumption that they're going to have a lot more performance under the hood than they're going to actually have. I feel like Scarlet and Violet was not developed for the Switch. It was developed for the Switch 2, and the Switch 2 just wasn't ready for launch yet, because clearly it should be a Switch 2 game, not a Switch 1 game. And that problem is not present in Legends ZA, because clearly they learned something. Clearly they learned that they needed to dial back the scope when it comes to games like this. And they need to find ways to better optimize things. But, you know, Legends ZA is also just a smaller map than Scarlet and Violet. And there's not as many Pokemon. And the Pokemon that do spawn, they're fewer. There's less of them spawning at any given time because they're relegated to either certain areas or very specific spots in the overworld where they're allowed to spawn, as opposed to Scarlet and Violet, which has dozens, if not hundreds, of spawn points loaded at a given time, and the game has to decide which ones spawn a Pokemon and which ones don't. And oftentimes those spawn points are in a wall. Like, this is not a video about Scarlet and Violet, but yeah, there's oftentimes people will find that you see all of the Pokemon that are loaded, and you discover one of them is just in a wall, and you just can't access it. Or you have to do some funky waiting for it to move so that its hitbox sort of juts out of the wall just a little bit so that you can actually engage it in battle. And people have pondered like how many shinies have been lost to Pokemon spawning in the wall, but that's a completely different discussion. The point being is that Game Freak at pretty much every step of the way over the entire course of Pokemon's history has sort of been, I guess, trying their hardest to push the franchise forward in spite of just how much Nintendo, the company that they've sort of tied their livelihood to, are working their hardest to hold the hardware back. And that has, at pretty much every turn, resulted in middling results for Game Freak. I will say that pretty much all of my favorite games are not the first entry on a specific console. Like, Sapphire was my first ever experience in a Pokemon game, but that game is an absolute mess of a Pokemon game. And so much of that game's development, I have to imagine, was put into the massive jump from the Game Boy Color to the Game Boy Advance. Because there's not a lot of content in that game. And if you really want the definitive Hoenn experience on the Game Boy Advance, Emerald is a vastly superior game to Ruby and Sapphire. And I would argue, in terms of a Pokemon game, Fire Red and Leaf Green offer a lot more of an experience than even Ruby and Sapphire do. Like, they're remakes, so no time was put into figuring out what the region was going to look like or what the story was going to be. So more time could have been spent on auxiliary features that made the game better. And that's true for pretty much every single new console that gets released. It was true for the DS. Diamond and Pearl are a glitchy mess of Pokemon games. X and Y are some of the worst games in the franchise, only beaten by games that were literally developed out of obligation, like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which, in my opinion, are the definitive worst games in the franchise if you're talking about mainline games. But Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu are also huge growing pains, but those games were so small in scope compared to some of these other games that they actually turned out pretty good for being the first foray into a Pokemon game on the Switch, but they're still a laggy mess. Like, if you go into Viridian Forest, like, you can count the number of frames that are being shown to you at any given time. It almost becomes a slideshow at a certain point. But if we're talking the true first definitive, like, from whole cloth experience on the Switch, Sword and Shield, especially if you're not counting the DLC, again, they're just not very holistic experiences. Like, you get so much more out of the games if you wait for the DLC to come out. There's just so much more content. There's just so much more to do. And that's completely ignoring the whole, like, Dexit situation. I don't even want to touch that can of worms right now. Dexit was a mess, and it was poorly handled both from Nintendo and Game Freak's perspective, but also from the fans' perspective. Like, they really did not do a good job of tempering their expectations going into Sword and Shield, and it shows. I feel like a lot of the criticisms being levied at that game are just people trying to find reasons to dislike the game so that they can justify being mad about the National Dex not being in the game. And this is a common theme throughout the franchise of Game Freak and the fans sort of being at odds with each other. And that's sort of a problem because we also have already mentioned that Game Freak and Nintendo are also sort of at odds with each other. And that goes for more than just the fact that Nintendo consistently puts out consoles with subpar hardware. It also comes down to the fact that Pokemon as a franchise has a very sort of curated timeline on how things are supposed to happen. Because of the fact that Pokemon is more than just a video game franchise, it doesn't have the luxury that franchises like Mario and Zelda do, where it can just delay a game because it's not done yet. If a Pokemon game isn't done yet and it's approaching the original deadline, like, you can't delay it. Like, that's when the game's coming out. Because it has to coincide with the release of certain TCG products, and it has to coincide with certain releases within the anime. The only time that they've ever sort of pushed back these things was at a time when the franchise was still new. Like if you go back to Generation 2, I don't know if I have the statistics to back this, but it was almost certainly delayed because you got an entire arc of the anime that has no TCG products and no video games to promote it. Like the Orange Islands is a filler arc to the point where a bunch of characters from that arc never show up again in the anime. And when they do, they only show up because Nintendo, Game Freak, Pokemon Company suddenly remembered, oh yeah, we did this filler arc back when Generation 2 wasn't done. And you can look at sort of how things were going because if it wasn't for the fact that one of the developers was able to basically come up with a compression algorithm to get the entirety of the Johto region compressed down enough to fit onto a Game Boy Color cartridge, the game would not have come out. But the fact that they were able to do that, they compressed it enough that they were even able to fit the entirety of the Kanto region on there. That's how impressive the compression technology was for the time. But, like, it's so obvious that so many of these Pokemon games, especially the last few, have been coming out in unfinished forms. You can see clips of the most egregious glitches from Scarlet and Violet, and if you go back to Sword and Shield, like, it's not as bad as Scarlet and Violet was, but it was still pretty bad. Like, performance issues, glitches, just whole features missing from the game day one. Like, you have these issues that sort of compound on each other over time to build distrust in the fan base and to sort of build this perception of Game Freak as being a company that rushes games out, which is really not their fault. Like, it's a bunch of factors working together. But the fact is that this is not the first time this has happened. You can go back and see evidence that this happened back in as early as Diamond and Pearl. You see some of the alpha builds that came out just a few months before Diamond and Pearl went live in Japan, and they have less than half, or maybe a little over half of that final game actually implemented. And there's a bunch of stuff in that that's going to change by the time the final version comes out. And that's only like less than a year out, a few months out from the release of the game, into a game that had multiple years of development between entries. Like, the fact is that Game Freak has not learned their lesson. They have not learned either to pull back on the initial scope or to try and curb the scope creep. Because these games, the scope of these games is getting way out of hand. And nowhere is that seen better than in the games where the scope is not that big. My wife sent me out here with a specific purpose, and I think I might have just now fulfilled it. So, I already mentioned that Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu, in terms of being Game Freak's first foray into developing a Switch game, turned out pretty good, all things considered. The biggest problem that those games have is just that there's not a lot to do. Like, it's just Kanto. And there's really not a post game in those games either. If you consider something like Cerulean Cave and like rebattling gym leaders, maybe like redoing the Elite Four a couple times, like maybe if you consider that post game, then yeah, the game's got like something to do once you beat the game. But really, the only thing that kept people coming back to Let's Go was just the fact that it was a good game to shiny hunt in. But that being said, the actual like core playing through the game was a very smooth experience. I mean, it was just Kanto. It's nothing like super crazy, right? You're not like reinventing the wheel by creating, the 5th run through of the Kanto region, but it is still a good, foundation for a game, right? It was the game that kicked the entire franchise off and has continued to be a very fertile ground for Nintendo to go back to in terms of farming nostalgia. I mean, Gen 1ers are some of the most uh, sort of easy to farm Pokemon fans that you can get. Give them the ability to catch the original 151, and you've got a banger product on your hands. Just go ask Pokemon Go how summer 2016 was. But all of that is sort of moot in the face of the game that really shows me just how much paring back the scope and allowing for sort of maybe not simplicity, but allowing for knowing how long you're going to have to develop a game really show in the final product. Nothing really exemplifies that more than the precursor to ZA, Arceus. Oh, we're inside. I can take the coat off. So what exactly is it about Legends Arceus that sort of transcends all of the problems that every Pokemon game around it for the last decade has had? Well, it sort of boils down to a couple things. Firstly, it is kind of a remake, but not really. I mentioned before that, certain games sort of introduce a new region. A lot of times saying sort of a mainline game comes with very specific criteria for what that actually means. And certain games, while important to the history of Pokemon, are not part of the mainline series of games. Games like the Ranger games, things like the Stadium, Battle Revolution, even things like XD and Coliseum, games that you can play like a normal Pokemon game and you can move those Pokemon to the main series. They're still not considered main series Pokemon games. Oftentimes, main series games are the game that kicks off a generation or a remake of a previous game. And Legends Arceus is kind of that. It is considered a mainline Pokemon game, but it considers its region to be different than the Sinnoh region that it's based on. It calls itself Hisui, but it is still Sinnoh. But it's also Hisui. It's its own thing, and it has its own new forms of old Pokemon. It has its own mythology, but it will eventually become Sinnoh. It's like, I can't think of a historical example, but imagine a country that became a different country. That's sort of what we're talking about here. I guess you would almost say like the Ottoman Empire becoming Turkey. Is that a thing? I don't know. I'll leave it in. The history nuts can flame me in the comments if I'm wrong. But the basic idea is there. You have this previous region that had games in the past and people remember and like them, and they want to re-experience those games. The traditional by the numbers remake that we got, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, that released around the same time as Legends Arceus, is bad. I already mentioned it's the worst game in the franchise, at least mainline, because it is considered a mainline Pokemon game, even though it is not developed by Game Freak. It was developed by Ilka. I'm not going to make the joke, but y'all can make the joke. Fundamentally, a remake tries to reuse as much of the old game as possible to sort of pad time between generations, but also to sort of reinvigorate older games. And in addition to that, in a world where expecting somebody to go out and purchase games that were released 20 odd years ago in order for them to get a Pokemon and move it all the way up through the other generations, requiring you to own 4 or 5 other games and 2 or 3 other consoles in order to get it to the current game, is a lot to ask for. So releasing a game like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl that allows you to get these older Pokemon without having to dip into these older games, and giving players an opportunity to catch them all, as the phrase once was that they've now abandoned, because we now have 1,000+ Pokemon to catch. So catching them all is kind of a chore. I mean, John Stone committed the absolute insane feat of doing it in a single stream, and that still took multiple days of nonstop playing Pokemon games. And even then, he still had to go back and buy older games in order to get some of these Pokemon, because certain Pokemon still are not available in modern games. That's just crazy. And so these remakes offer an opportunity to reintroduce older Pokemon into the franchise that maybe don't fit the theming of the current new region Pokemon games. With the DLC and stuff like that, it's really become sort of moot. I mean, maybe Patrat doesn't really make sense to appear in Scarlet and Violet. Why? I don't really know. But you could have very easily just made it a random spawn in the terrarium. The terrarium is literally artificially there. Pokemon were put there by people to be caught. There isn't a real ecological reason why those Pokemon are there. Those environments were artificially created and then artificially populated by people in order for them to be caught. So, I mean, does it really need to be a thing? And then we end up getting Legend ZA, and a bunch of Pokemon that weren't available previously are now available, including a bunch of legendaries and mythicals. But at the end of the day, these remakes offer something in addition to that. They offer an opportunity to explore newer mechanics in these older games. And in no way is that more interestingly implemented than in Legend ZA. Man, I just want to sit down so bad. So, Legends Arceus is technically a Pokemon game. So, let's sort of talk about what a Pokemon game is. In the original Red and Blue, it was a turn-based RPG where you would catch monsters, train them, level them up. Each monster had a move set of 4 moves, and you would use those moves to fight an opponent's Pokemon, monster, whatever, and hopefully their HP would hit 0 before your HP hit 0. And over time, that gameplay loop evolved. But one thing that really didn't evolve was the framework within which these games were created. Because while there is a core gameplay loop to Pokemon, a turn-based fighting RPG that featured pocket monsters with a 4-move slot, move set, they had types. Eventually, they had abilities. Eventually, they were allowed to hold items. And eventually, their stats were overhauled. The way that the stats interacted with moves and types was overhauled. And over time, more things were changed, more things were adjusted. But, if you play Red and Blue and you understand the core mechanics of how that fighting game works, playing a modern Pokemon game 99 times out of 100 is going to be an easy transition, because the core sort of mechanics of the fight and the core mechanics of the gameplay have not changed in 30 years. And that's a problem, but also a really important feature of Pokemon. Because on the one hand, it's a problem that everything surrounding the gameplay mechanics of Pokemon, sort of the region designs, the Pokemon designs, the designs of how the moves are learned and how they are distributed, the sort of flow of a Pokemon game, the mechanisms by which you earn certain things within a Pokemon game, and sort of the mechanisms by which the game tries to teach you the mechanics of its own game. Those have evolved a lot over time. Everything surrounding the core battle mechanics of Pokemon have changed drastically in the 9 iterations that Pokemon has undergone in terms of core generations. The core fundamental underlying way that battles occur has not changed. So, if you enter a Pokemon battle in Red and Blue, you could have functionally the exact same fight between the exact same Pokemon play out the exact same way in Red version, and then replicate that same battle with the exact same Pokemon, making the exact same moves play out basically the exact same way in Scarlet and Violet. Pretty much the same button presses, the same, alterations to the Pokemon's stats as the battle progresses, and really the same feeling you get at the end of the battle in both games. The only thing that's different is that when you leave that battle in Red, the way to get to the next battle is in pretty much every conceivable way different than how you get to the next battle in Scarlet and Violet. There's no grid. You are not forced into battles when you enter a trainer's line of sight. The Pokemon now roam in the overworld instead of being thrown at you in a new screen as you walk through grass. And there are so many cutscenes in Scarlet and Violet, just a disgusting amount. The bike is now a Pokemon. The bike's a Pokemon now. And that's something that's really jarring if you go from playing Red and Blue directly to playing Scarlet and Violet. Is that a bad thing? No. In Sun and Moon, when they moved away from the need for HMs and instead made it where you now have Pokemon that you can call on to do the moves you need to interact with the environment, it was cinema. It was peak. And the fact that it was not something that was implemented sooner felt like a travesty. In fact, ROM hacks of older Pokemon games implement similar features so that you don't have to do that anymore. So that you don't have to have a Pokemon on your team knowing certain moves in order to interact with the environment. But there's something to the HM system, isn't there? There's something to having one of the Pokemon you trained up help you traverse the terrain. Do you want to just hop on some random hose Lapras? Or do you want to hop on the Swampert that you've trained for the entire playthrough up to this point? The Pokemon that helped you free Professor Birch from the Zigzagoon. The Pokemon that got that clutch critical hit against Flannery. The Pokemon that learned a ground type move just in time for the electric type gym. The Pokemon that every time one of your other Pokemon was in a clutch moment and was about to die, it could switch in, take a hit while you heal the other one in the back. Even in casual playthroughs, these things matter. And in a more sort of serious playthrough like a Nuzlocke, it matters a lot. In a challenge run specifically designed to get you attached to your Pokemon, where the rule sets are literally built to require you to build an attachment to these Pokemon and feel bad when you let them die, to those Pokemon also being the way that you traverse the world, for, a Pokemon named after a friend or a location or even just a number to be the Pokemon that you hop on the back of to get from Moss Deep to Sutopolis, for you to get from why am I blanking on the starting town in Pallet, for the Pokemon that helps you get from Pallet Town to Cinnabar Island, for the Pokemon that helps you climb the rocks up Mount Coronet, for the Pokemon that helps you ascend that waterfall before you face off against the Elite Four at Indigo Plateau, at Evergreen City, at whatever it's called in Diamond and Pearl. I can't remember. But for these Pokemon to be such important and integral parts of your team, but also be the Pokemon that helps you finish your playthrough. It's lost when the HM system is gone. The move to your bike being a Pokemon, to your HMs now being sort of these callable Pokemon in a nebulous place in Sun and Moon, to being your bike in Sword and Shield, and then again in Scarlet and Violet, it's not the same. I don't necessarily think that they need to go back, but it's a pragmatic decision that is made at the expense of the immersion. And I do think that there's something to be said about being able to immerse yourself in a game because certain frustrating mechanics have been removed. But there's also something to be said about the mythology of an HM slave. A Pokemon caught explicitly because it can learn a critical mass of moves that are required to progress the story. Would you have a B-Barrel on your team for as long as you do if it wasn't for the fact that it can learn so many useful moves that can be used outside of battle? Sure, it takes up a slot in your party and makes it where you're functionally using a 5 Pokemon team instead of a 6 Pokemon team. And maybe you put it in the box when you're not in need of HMs, right? But the fact that it comes out ever and is used ever is a legacy. And that's just not something that we get in modern Pokemon games. And that's sad, but it's also inevitable. The steady, slow movement of progress, sometimes supercharged by the giant leaps forward that we have every once in a while. It is inevitable, but it's also a little comforting sometimes to know that in spite of the fact that things continue to change and things continue to quote unquote improve, we can still go back and enjoy the wabi sabi. Was I talking about something else? Right. Legends Arceus. So, part of the reason why Arceus turned out so differently from other mainline Pokemon games in this regard was because of the fact that it had a very streamlined development process, due to the fact that so much of it was based on an already existing game. And the fact is that because so much of the Pokédex was going to be taken up by Pokemon that have already been designed and have already sort of been balanced around each other, you really don't have to do that much work to sort of fill in the gaps. Like, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they only really introduced like 4 brand new Pokemon in it. Like, They gave Quillfish a new evolution. They gave Ursaring a new evolution. They gave Scyther a new evolution. And was there another one? I forget. I'm sure there's another one. And then they also gave, regional variants, which became sort of a mainstay of the series after Sun and Moon. But that's not a lot. That's like a couple dozen new designs, and most of them are either evolutions of existing Pokemon where they can take design ideas from the previous evolution, or they're just redesigns of those older Pokemon. And the basic shape and structure of the Pokemon is not going to change. Like, the two forms of Quillfish functionally look exactly the same. They just have different color palettes and have slightly different features on parts of their body. Like, the marks on the end of Quillfish's tail go from being just like a squiggle to being a Q. And he's black now. That's basically it, right? And that's not a lot of work. So you really don't have to dedicate a lot of dev time to doing that. In addition, the region is already designed for you. Like, yeah, they have to completely remodel everything for the new engine, but like, they don't have to sketch what the region's going to look like. They have a map. And it's a different region technically, right? But the geography is pretty much exactly the same. Like, if you took a region map of Sinnoh and a region map of Hisui and overlaid them on top of each other, they would disappear into each other because they're the same map. Like, a few things have changed because, the inexorable passage of time, but Game Freak wants you to recognize these old spots. They want you to say, hey, this is where Mount Coronet would have been. This is where Hearthome City was back in the day. This is where the lakes are that house the Lake Trio, right? This is where certain islands in the game would have been. This is where key bodies of water are. It's not difficult to be able to see the time that was saved in the fact that it's a remake. And in addition to that, the core gameplay of Pokemon is fairly simple, and implementing a brand new engine that uses the battle mechanics of Pokemon is not hard. Like, people have created brand new Pokemon games from scratch in some pretty crazy languages for some pretty crazy engines, just as a side project, just to kill time. Like, the core gameplay mechanics of how to do a Pokemon fight are not that hard. Like, Game Freak continues to reinvent the wheel and create new battle gimmicks, but those gimmicks are being slotted into an engine that has existed since 1995. So it's really not that hard, right? Like, you're not creating a completely new way to play Pokemon. Except you kind of are with this one, because I don't remember the exact number, but it's only like a couple dozen fights even exist in the entirety of Legends Arceus. There's no gyms, there's no Elite Four, there's really not even like random trainers scattered throughout the region that you can fight. It's just an open world Pokemon game where the entire point is you just catch Pokemon. And that's a refreshing change of pace for a game that has, again, for 8 out of the 9 generations, been the exact same template. You beat 8 gyms, you beat some evil team, you go to the Elite Four, and then you beat the champion. That's the core gameplay loop of Pokemon. That's the structure and the template and the sort of framework that every Pokemon game has been built with. The only game that breaks this sort of structure is Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which instead of having gyms has trials and totems, which in my opinion felt like a breath of fresh air at the time. Like, I was really excited to see where they were going to go with it, only for Sword and Shield to just fall right back into the gym structure have 8 gyms, an extremely linear game that ended in an Elite Four and a champion, basically. Like, it was a little different, and there was like some evil team stuff thrown in there. They already did that with Black and White. Like, the true champion of Black and White isn't Alder, it's Getsus. Getsus is the final big boss of that game. And that game came out 3 generations before it. Like, almost a decade before. And we're seeing this as innovation coming off the heels of a generation that didn't have gyms. I was disappointed in Sun and Moon when it had an Elite Four. I thought maybe we'd see them even innovate on that idea. And I thought maybe with Sword and Shield, we'd have something similar to the trial system, but with sort of sports teams. And then the Elite Four would be something that they would innovate on. But instead, we fall back on the gym structure, and then we have sort of like a tournament style Elite Four at the end. But it still is just a gauntlet of trainers that ultimately culminates in a champion fight. And it's even worse than that, because the gauntlet of trainers at the end of Sword and Shield, you have massive downtime between fights to the point where you could just straight up change your team between fights in the tournament. And maybe that's more true to an actual Pokemon like experience if you're doing something like that. Like, if you look at the way that Ash plays in a lot of the tournaments at the end of the animes, he does change his team up between fights sometimes, like altering his team structure to try and counter a trainer that he knows has certain Pokemon, or slotting Pokemon out to try and give him a break. I mean, it does kind of fit in with the way that they do it in the anime a little more, but they do weird stuff in the anime. That's not necessarily something that needs to be reflected in the games, even though the games have been working to be more like the anime for years, and the anime has been bending over backwards to be more like the games for years. But at the end of the day, it's the same basic structure. You know, you get your starter, you get told, hey, go beat the 8 gyms, and on the way, some evil team comes along and you have to kick their butts, and then you go beat the Elite Four and the champion, and you beat the game. And some games take that structure and do something really interesting with it. Black and White, for example, like I already mentioned, has one of the most sort of thought-provoking and interesting stories of any Pokemon game. It's really good. The gameplay and the actual main campaign of the game is very linear and very one-note, and doesn't really do much to sort of instill any sort of sense of awe. But the story that's being told as you're playing the game is really interesting, and really is something that I did not expect a company like Game Freak to actually tackle in a Pokemon game, let alone a game as early in the franchise's history as Black and White. And Sun and Moon, in a lot of the same ways, innovated on the stories as well. Like, X and Y has some of the worst story of any Pokemon game. It's really shallow and it's really boring, and it's to the point where I couldn't tell you a single thing about any of the gym leaders from that region, and I played through the game at least once, but only once, because it was not interesting. Like, I can tell you a ton of stuff about Pokemon trainers from games that I played several times through that I consider to be not my favorite Pokemon games. X and Y, I just can't do that. And Sun and Moon did a really good job of making the characters compelling and having a pretty wide variety of characters that all felt like distinct characters that you actually cared about. Like, I cared about Lily. I cared about Lily's brother. I can't remember his name. Lusamine, is that her name? Yeah, Lusamine, the mom. Like, her arc in the original Sun and Moon is tragic. It sucks. And it's something that is real. It's like, that's something that parents put their kids through sometimes. Sometimes you got to cut your parents out because they're toxic. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon kind of undermined that by making it where instead of just being like a toxic parent that sort of fell into mental illness after her kids left, she was just under the control of the Ultra Beast the whole time and is redeemed in the end. But if you just take the original games at face value, once a parent does something like that, you kind of have to make a choice, right? They're still your parents. This is all a conversation that's being had at the behest of talking about Pokemon. Like, I'm going to cut myself off here. You understand what I'm saying here, right? Like, Black and White and Sun and Moon have the types of story that really just make you actually think about what the characters are going through and whether or not you can actually sympathize with characters that were considered to be villains and considered to be evil up until this point. And now things are being brought to light where you start to wonder, hey, maybe I should be sympathetic towards these characters. Very few other Pokemon games evoke that kind of emotion. Again, in X and Y, the villain's entire plot is we want everyone to be more fashionable. That's basically what it boils down to. And they wind up trying to destroy the entire world in the process because, again, the main villain winds up getting so diluted by power that he completely loses track of what the entire point is. And pretty much every evil team in the history of Pokemon have been terrorists in some way. Like, organized crime kicked the franchise off. That's what Team Rocket is. They are the mob. They're mafia. And then Generation 3 introduced eco-terrorists. Like, that's where this franchise started. Like, you go from literal, like, I'm kind of seeing The Godfather, but I think it's about a mob boss. But, like, you go from a Godfather-style villain in Giovanni to having, like, freaking, literal eco-terrorists trying to get rid of all the water or get rid of all the land, and using legendary mythical cryptids in that pursuit. And then Generation 4 basically takes that eco-terrorist angle and just completely takes it to the next level by making it where those cryptids that control the water and the land, we are now harnessing what can only be described as this universe's version of gods that control space and time, and what the Pokemon world probably considers hell in the distortion world. Take these creatures and just clean slate start over, Noah's Ark style, because the villain thinks that the world is too far gone. A game that came out in like 2011. And then Generation 5, again, I don't really want to talk too much about the story of Generation 5 because I think you should actually go experience it if you've never played it. But that game does a really good job of sort of iterating on the stories that the games have had up to this point. But even in a world where you are taking into consideration the fact that, there's the mob, eco-terrorists, like literally a guy trying to play God, like, these games still have very shallow stories. Like, you just sort of run into these people every once in a while, and then in the end you fight the boss, and when the boss is defeated, you just thwart their plans, either by killing the Pokemon that they're trying to use or just by demoralizing the guy, and he just kind of runs off and hides in the case of Giovanni. And future generations try their best to either sort of dial it back in the case of X and Y, or lean hard into sort of the way that these bosses function in the universe, if you're talking about games like Black and White and Sun and Moon. Sword and Shield just kind of has a guy that owns a company and decides to commit terrorism just kind of casually. There's really not a good reason. And Scarlet and Violet doesn't even have an evil team. There's not a villain in that game. Like, the villain in that game is bullying, I guess. Like, the story's not good, folks. At least from a perspective of that. Like, the characters in Scarlet and Violet are good, and the climax at the end where you fight the AI is also good. And I grew to care about the characters, especially Arvin, but still, it doesn't come close to matching sort of what Black and White and Sun and Moon were able to accomplish. But at the end of the day, what you're dealing with in terms of the stories with these games is pretty rudimentary, even for the good ones. Like Black and White, while having a really good story, is not winning an Oscar anytime soon. Like you're not going to be seeing movie adaptations of Pokemon Black and White and see them do very well because it's a story that's been told plenty of times. It's just an interesting story to tell on the backdrop of Pokemon. Same with Sun and Moon. But Legends Arceus is different. Legends Arceus not only doesn't have gyms and doesn't have sort of an evil team in the traditional sense, it doesn't really care about its own plot most of the time. And the progression in that game is really interesting. I think if you're talking strictly about how the story progresses, there are huge chunks of gameplay in that game where nothing story related happens. And when the story stuff does happen, it happens kind of all at once. And you're just sort of thrown into the deep end as things start to get real. And it's good. I enjoyed it. I would definitely go back and replay through the campaign and have a good time. But at the end of the day, again, it's not really pushing any boundaries, even in the world of Pokemon, which itself doesn't push any boundaries at all, really. But again, the story is not the reason most people play a Pokemon game. It's the actual gameplay. And in Legends Arceus, the gameplay is really good. In fact, as I've already sort of alluded to, it's nothing like other Pokemon games. Other Pokemon games work so hard to try and weave the new battle mechanic into the story of the game, where X and Y ties the weapon that Lysander uses to Mega Evolution. The trials in Sun and Moon give you Z crystals to be able to use Z moves, and trainers throughout the game at key points use Z moves against you. Sword and Shield, like the Darkest Day is just everybody Dynamaxes now. You don't get to see it, which is really dumb, but it is just a bunch of wild Pokemon randomly Dynamaxing, and it works really hard to try and weave that into the story. Same with Scarlet and Violet with terastallization. And so many other mechanics over time have sort of been weaved into the main through line of the Pokemon story. But Legends Arceus cares so little about its own story in relation to the actual mechanics of the game that it doesn't have to worry itself with trying to justify why you're playing the game or why the gameplay works the way that it does. Because from the onset, everything is built around a few central conceits. The first conceit is that you are in an ancient world and you are researching Pokemon. And I know that that's sort of been the case with a lot of different Pokemon games, but in those games, the Pokédex already exists. In this game, you are creating the Pokédex. You are researching Pokemon, and it goes far beyond just catching them. And this is where Legends Arceus sort of sets itself apart, sets itself well above its contemporaries, because it's not a matter of going out and just catching a Pokemon and then having its Pokédex entry completed. You have to complete a bunch of research tasks, and those research tasks are tied to stars that you can earn on your rank within the organization that you are completing the Pokédex for, And those star ranks are what your progression are tied to. You unlock new areas after a certain number of stars. You unlock certain items to be able to use after a certain number of stars. And you are able to progress to the final area of the game once you have completed a certain number of stars. And those tasks include a bunch of things. But ultimately, the biggest thing that those tasks offer is an excuse to just go out and interact with the world and interact with the Pokemon. Like, there's tasks to feed wild Pokemon. There's tasks to scare them with a flashbang. There's tasks to stun them with sticky globs. There's tasks to catch them without being seen. There's tasks to catch certain sizes of ones. And there's tasks to have seen them use certain moves in battle. And all of this culminates in a system where if you want to progress, you have to go out and actually engage with the Pokemon where they're at. And oftentimes you have to sneak up on them in order to be able to complete certain tasks. And that's really cool. Like, it's bird watching, but for Pokemon. And that's awesome. It's basically everything people loved about Snap, but it's an actual game. It's not just an on the rails point and click shooter game where you shoot with a camera instead of a gun. It's an open world, open ended Pokemon game where you are dropped into their world and forced to meet them on their terms. Because unlike the Sinnoh that Hisui would eventually become, there's no infrastructure. There's no buildings. There's no trainers waiting for you. There's no carved out roads. You're just in a massive landscape shaped by nature, populated by the Pokemon that live there in that time. And it's a beautiful thing. It's like going to a national park. It's like walking on trails as animals just live their lives around you. Maybe you throw some seed to a bird. You skip a stone in the water. Maybe you hop on a bike and ride around and just listen to the ambient noises around you as you just soak in the beauty of the world around you. And the sound design in Legends Arceus is immaculate. It's so good. You can hear the cries of the Pokemon around you. You can hear the wind. You can hear the rushing waters. You can hear all kinds of just ambient sounds. And the music is just this gentle ambient music that just adds to the atmosphere. To the point I found enjoyment just running around, just listening to what there was to hear in the world around me. And I spent quite a bit of time just doing that. And part of it was because I was listening for the shiny sound, but just the allure of getting a shiny isn't enough sometimes. Sometimes you need something else drawing you to that game. And nowhere else is that clearer than in Legends ZA. Because Legends Arceus clearly had a lot of care put into the catching mechanics. You can sneak up on Pokemon, throw Pokeballs at them. It feels like I feign to call it Dark Souls because it's not Dark Souls in the sense that it's really hard. It's Dark Souls in the sense that Pokemon are enemies. You can roll to dodge their attacks. You can hit them with weapons, if you want to call them that. You can engage them in a fight if you want, in a more traditional Pokemon sense of a turn-based fight. Or you can just engage with them in real time. Throw Pokeballs, throw globs to stun them, throw a flashbang to scare them away. You know, run away far enough that they lose interest in you, and then come back in a way that they don't see you, and try to catch them without ever actually engaging with them. And there's so many different ways to play Legends Arceus. There's so many different strategies that you can employ, whether it be using the smoke bombs to hide yourself, whether it be using the grass that Game Freak put in the world to hide yourself, whether it be just running in gung-ho Leroy Jenkins style and just stunning everything and throwing balls in a massive frenzy, or just chucking a ball out and engaging whatever you happen to have aggroed in a Pokemon battle, and then moving on to the next group of Pokemon to engage. You can play the game in a myriad of different ways, and that's fun, that's exciting. It offers not only skill expression, but it also allows you to show your personality in the way that you play the game. And that's fun. That's a really cool way to design a Pokemon game. Something that is not present in Legends ZA, because the catching mechanics in Legends ZA were not given any sort of thought from my perspective, and they were not pulled whole cloth from Legends Arceus. That game came out an entire game and 2 rounds of DLC ago. We're well past the point of making a game and reusing assets from a game that came out a couple years ago. Like, that's just Game Freak's MO. They're going to reinvent the wheel that's already there. That's just sort of what they do. But they tried to make it as similar to the original Legends game as possible. You can still, creep up on a Pokemon and throw a Pokeball at them without them noticing. But the problem is Legends ZA takes place in Lumiose, the main city in X and Y, which for me was a really good thing. And we'll get to that. But ultimately, from a actual functional, how it turned out, execution perspective, there's not really very many opportunities for you to put grass in a city in order to have a clean way to sneak up on a Pokemon like you can in Legends Arceus. In Legends ZA, oftentimes you try to sneak up on a Pokemon, and even if you creep up on them, they're going to notice you, and if they're the type of Pokemon that's skittish, they're just going to run away. Like, the number of times it took me to actually catch a Fennekin, because every time I creeped up on it, it noticed me and ran away, because I had to hide behind a wall that made it where I couldn't throw Pokeballs at it because they would hit the wall. Same with Dratini. Dratini is also skittish. It took running into an alpha for Dratini in order for me to actually have a meaningful fight. And at that point, I hadn't learned the trick of saving right when you kill it and soft resetting over and over to try and catch the fainted Pokemon. I failed the Alpha Dratini and had to come back and try to catch a skittish one in order to complete the Pokédex entry. And in Legends ZA, the entry is just an entry. It's just a standard Pokédex, like every other Pokédex in every other Pokemon game. There's no research tasks. There's not even tasks associated with battling with the Pokemon. The only other entries that you get are for the Megas, which is not that novel. It's not that interesting. It's tedious, because in order to get the Megas, some of them you receive over the course of just playing through the normal game, but that's not enough to actually complete all of the tasks associated with receiving Megas. Because unlike previous games, you don't just get the Shiny Charm for completing the Pokédex. You get the Shiny Charm for completing a series of research tasks that are completely arbitrary. You basically have to catch like 50 of each type of Pokemon. Then you have to catch every Pokemon in each designated wild zone, which is basically their version of routes. And then you also have to fight 1,000 Pokemon battles. 1,000. A number you get a quarter of the way through if you are playing through the main campaign and doing extra. I did extra fights in addition to the required number of fights you have to do to complete the game, and I barely crossed over the quarter mark in terms of getting through the 1,000. That's crazy. And if you want to do all of the mega tasks required, you are required to buy some of them. Not all of them. You don't have to buy all of them, but you have to buy at least most of them. And some of them are available to purchase with actual money, but they're very expensive. But then some of them you have to purchase with mega shards, which can only be obtained by breaking overworld obstacles with your Pokemon's moves. And they don't drop a lot of shards. At most, if you've like maxed out your canary plushies, which is a mechanic I'm not going to get into, I think the best possible yield is something like 20 shards per thing you broke, if you break a really big one. And in order to get a single Megastone at its cheapest, you have to spend 240 shards. That's 12 of those big crystals broken. And those big crystals only spawn in certain places. And once you break them, you have to wait real minutes in order for it to respawn. There's like guides on Reddit in order to get like optimal routing to max out your shards. But it takes 30 minutes of optimal routing to max out your shards to 999. And when you hit 999, if you collect more shards, they just disappear. They just go away. And it doesn't tell you when you're full up on shards. I had been maxed out for who knows how long and didn't realize it. And didn't realize that that was a thing. And ended up having to really keep track of how many shards I had and so that I didn't cap out. Because you do get them fairly quickly if you're like really grinding for it. But it is a grind. And thankfully, if you spend actual money, you don't have to get all of the ones that cost shards. But if your plan is to actually get all of them and be able to use all the megas at some point, you do have to actually grind shards for it. Thankfully, with the DLC, I think shards are a lot easier to get, but it also adds more megas. And like I said at the top of the video, I don't have the DLC yet because I'm poor. So I don't actually know how you get most of these new megas, if they're just handed to you or if the shop adds them and you have to either buy them at the Stone Emporium or use shards to buy them at Quizartico. But at the end of the day, it don't matter. Like, it's still a pain either way. And that 1,000 battle requirement is moot once you get the DLC because they add more mega tasks. And those tasks basically make it where you don't have to do 1,000 battles. I don't even think you have to do 500 because there's so many new megas that got added. All the megas that weren't in the original run that were in X and Y or Oris are now added. And they added something like, what was it, like 19 new megas in the newest round? Like, it's crazy. So, yeah, anybody who grinded those 1,000 battles, a lot of them feel like they got scammed. And that's totally fair. But in addition to that, again, I haven't played the DLC, but everything I've seen is people saying that it's not good. It falls well short of expectations for what this was going to be. How it's implemented is a disaster. Like, how you accrue resources that are necessary in order to progress the story is just extremely tedious. They have not fixed it yet, from my understanding. And the actual story to the DLC is just underwhelming. And that's a remake of a game that the post game was the best part of X and Y. The Looker Saga was the only part of X and Y I actually remember. When they showed Emma in the trailer, I was hyped. She was like my favorite character in the original X and Y because every other character was just a block of wood. Like, nobody had any personality. But her and Looker's dynamic in the Looker Saga was really good. I would go back and replay X and Y just to do the Looker Saga. It was good. And it was the same with the Delta episode in Oris. Like, those two things were the best parts of those two games, respectively. So, like, the fact that they managed to make the added post-game content of this game so bad, it's really sad. Like, it's just sad. And in addition to that, you know,
expectations were really high going into this game, especially for me. Again, as somebody who liked Legends Arceus as much as I did, I was really hoping that Legends ZA was going to sort of iterate on some of the stuff that made Legends Arceus so good. But in classic Game Freak fashion, they didn't iterate on any of it. They just completely overhauled what made the original game good, and in doing so, made it bad. Like, the catching mechanics in this game, they suck. They're really bad. They made it where when you kill a Pokemon, you have one last opportunity to try and catch it while it's fainted. It's really not good. It's really abusable by saving right before you try and catch it and then just soft resetting until you catch it. But if you don't do that and you just try to engage with the game in the way that you're supposed to, oftentimes, even when a Pokemon's fainted, it doesn't catch. And it's really frustrating. And if it's a really rare Pokemon or even a shiny Pokemon, you could end up failing it completely by accident because you didn't understand how the mechanics work. And in addition to that, the battle mechanics, like, they're really good. Like, I really enjoy the core gameplay loop of doing fights in ZA. It was a really jarring change, the way that they implemented fights. But once I got into the game and once I started actually, like, having fights in the game, it was really fun. Like, it's really snappy and it's really satisfying to, like, lock onto a Pokemon and just absolutely destroy them in one hit. But it's also satisfying to, like, have a really, like, competitive back and forth, to be sort of cycling between moves waiting for your good one to, like, charge up just because you need to get that chip damage on the rogue megas or on powerful bosses at any given point in the story. Like, it's a really satisfying system, and it's a shame that they really did not do a very good job of making the trainer battles very good. Like, ranked PvP sucks. It's really bad. Like, it basically rewards you for just taking legendaries and maxing them out and just taking those into ranked. Like, once Mewtwo was released, that was the only thing people were playing on ranked, was Mewtwo. And the trainer battles are almost exclusively relegated to the ZA Royale, and the ZA Royale is just boring. Like, it's really not that interesting. Like, it's just the same repetitive, tedious grind every single time. Like, and it takes so long to go from fight to fight. Like, the optimal way to do it is to sneak up on somebody. But in order to do that, you have to, like, sit and wait for them to turn around. You have to, like, charge them and hope that your Pokemon's fast enough to get a hit off before they turn back around and notice you. And, like, oftentimes their cycles for, like, noticing you feel like they're completely random. Like, there's no rhyme or reason to how long they were turned around. And it heavily incentivizes you to just find a Pokemon that's really fast and hits really hard and just use that over and over in the trainer battles, completely ignoring type matchup, completely ignoring any sort of, like, diversity in your team. Just have a bunch of really hard hitting fast Pokemon so that when you do have an opportunity to, like, hit them while they're not paying attention, you can do it before they have a chance to turn around. Because, like, I tried using Pokemon that I liked, but some of them were just too slow. Like, they took too long to get over to the Pokemon, and by the time they were, like, winding up a move, the person would turn around mid-animation, and my animation would be cut off because now I'm on the back foot in the fight because my Pokemon was too slow. That's so annoying. At least in Legends Arceus, it had the good sense to, like, implement its core mechanics in a way that didn't waste my time. And Legends ZA wastes a ton of my time. And coming back to the whole X and Y being bad games, like, I personally thought that Legends ZA was one of the first times in Pokemon's history where they were sort of falling back and revisiting an old game that really, really deserved to have a remake. X and Y had a lot of interesting concepts. Like, it introduced the best battle gimmick that we've had aside from like double battles, because there's that one guy on Shorts or whatever that claims that that's the best battle gimmick that they've come out with. You're probably right, dude, but like that's not what we mean when we say battle gimmicks. Like rotation battle is like a battle gimmick. Mega evolution, that's really what we mean when we say battle gimmicks, right? But regardless, like Mega Evolution is one of the coolest things that Pokemon has ever introduced. And some of the best designs that they've ever come up with were some of the Megas. Even the new ones, which I think a lot of them are pretty bad. Um, Probably not the ones you're thinking of, but it's difficult because so much time has passed since the original round of Megas were created that Game Freak's eye for design has changed so much that obviously the new designs aren't going to fit in with the old designs because Game Freak's design choices are just different now than they were when X and Y and Oris came out. It's the same as like Electivire and Elekid looking so much different from Electabuzz in terms of like the design choices, right? Same with like Ursaluna looking so different from Ursaring and just almost not even feeling like a real evolution of it, feeling like just almost like a different regional form, right? Like the jarring way that like Mime Jr. evolves into Galarian Mr. Mime. Like that's just not right. That shouldn't be how it works. Like you should have a Hisuian Ursaring that evolves into Ursaluna that actually fits the design like themes and choices that were made at the time that Legends Arceus was coming out. But that's a different discussion. Like there are still some really cool megas that came out in Legends ZA and in the DLC. I've already spoiled myself on what all the megas look like for the DLC, so like you don't have to worry about that. But some of them look really cool. Like I'm not going to spoil it for the people that haven't had a chance to play the DLC, but just speaking about the ones that are in the base game, like I think Mega Feraligatr looks pretty cool. Like I'm actually a pretty huge fan of Mega Holucha. Like it's not like a significant change from the original design, but it's still something and it's really cool. Holucha deserved a Mega. And a bunch of other Pokemon also deserved Megas. Like Drampa deserved a Mega. A bunch of other Pokemon that got new Megas, I was like, that's really cool, and I appreciate that this Pokemon got a Mega. Maybe didn't need a Mega. Like, did we really need Mega Zygarde? Like, I get that it makes sense just from like a core gameplay perspective. Like, obviously the main legendary for the game is probably going to get a Mega, but like you already have 100% form that wasn't in the original X and Y and was introduced in Sun and Moon. Now you've also got a Mega, so you've got 10% form, 50% form, 100% form, and then 100% form can become Mega. So you've got 4 forms for the same Pokemon that all are just varying amounts of powered up, basically. And that's kind of silly. But again, most of the Megas, I think the Pokemon deserved them. They were really cool designs. Some of them I think are really silly. Like I think Mega Phalanx is really silly. But like there's more implications to the Megas than just this game. Because from the perspective of the mainline games, Megas are not going to be in Generation 10. Like when they kick off Generation 10 with whatever the games are going to be, I think leaks are saying that it's going to be Wind and Water version or whatever. Like, assuming that that's the case, when Pokemon Wind and Water versions come out, like those games are not going to feature Megas. But Pokemon Champions is going to feature Megas. And it's going to not only feature the new Megas, it's going to feature the new Megas. And they're probably going to have abilities. And that is a really cool prospect. And the fact that these mechanics are being sort of iterated upon and then they're allowing them to come back into competitive consciousness through champions is really cool. And I'm really excited about that. But the frustrating thing is that the mainline Pokemon games just feel like they've been missing the mark for a long time. And Legends Arceus was the closest I think the franchise came to a Pokemon game that really justifies its own existence in the modern landscape. But it justifies its own existence by not really being a Pokemon game anymore. And that's sort of the crux of why modern Pokemon games are so frustrating for a lot of people. It's sort of lost the sauce to a certain extent. Like, they've so thoroughly tried to move away from what Pokemon was in 1995 while still clinging with every fiber of their being to the exact same battle engine that they've used since 1995. And as a result, you have a Pokemon game that when you step into a Pokemon battle, you're transported back to a point in time where you may very well have not been born yet. But when you walk around the overworld, you're being transported to a time that really doesn't exist or won't exist. Like, the overworld in Scarlet and Violet and Sword and Shield, especially when you were in the wild area, felt like they were trying to be Breath of the Wild. That was sort of the comparison that was always being made, because that was sort of the open world Pokemon game, or the open world game at the time that everyone was sort of comparing things to. But then you enter into a Pokemon battle and it's just the same stuff we've had for 30 years. Like, yeah, you got Dynamax or you got terrestrialization, but you don't actually have to do that. Like, you can just not click the Dynamax button, just not click the terrestrialization button. You can not click the Z move button. You can never give your Pokemon a Mega Stone. You're going to have to fight Megas. You're going to have your opponent use Z moves on you. Your opponent might Dynamax or terrestrialize at some point. But you don't actually ever have to engage with those systems. At the end of the day, the game is still designed for babies. And the core gameplay loop has to be beatable by a 5-year-old. So if you enter into a battle, you could theoretically click random buttons and have an above 50% chance of winning the fight. And that kind of sucks. But at the same time, whose fault is that really? Is it Game Freak's fault? I don't think so. Game Freak clearly wants to not be that anymore. If Legends Arceus and Legends ZA are any indication, they don't want to be making games for babies. They want to be making games for like children still, maybe teenagers, but like they don't want to be making games for babies anymore. But Nintendo cares a lot about the games being accessible to everybody. But I mean, if you go back and actually play the older Pokemon games, they weren't exactly easy. Like, newer Pokemon games are actually a lot easier than older Pokemon games. Like, if you go all the way back to Red and Blue, I made that comparison where the battles are exactly the same. When you leave the battles and actually try to traverse the overworld in Red and Blue, it can be kind of hard. There's no waypoints. There's no NPC following you around telling you where to go. Like, you just kind of have to figure it out. And that was fine. Kids figured it out. Like, kids are smarter than I think people give them credit. And it sucks that we have to keep pretending like kids can't handle that kind of stuff. Because they can. You throw them in front of a Pokemon game that's actually got some difficulty to it, and they'll bash their head against it till they figure it out. There's kids playing Dark Souls and doing well. Like, this is not new. This is not complicated. But at the end of the day, that's not what parents are thinking. Parents don't want their kids having to bash their head against a Pokemon game, or a game really at all. They want their kids to just be passively entertained. So focus groups are not going to get you there. Neither is, prioritizing profits. But again, that's sort of a different point to be made. The overarching point that I would like to make is that modern Pokemon is sort of, I guess, eating its own tail to a certain extent. And I would love to see Pokemon try and do better. This was not it, Game Freak. I'm extremely disappointed in the product that we got out of Legends EA, and I'm hoping that we get something better with Generation 10. But honestly, I'm done holding my breath.